Karen tried to mess with a royal guard, then this happened. The morning sun painted the iconic palace gates in hues of gold, casting long shadows over the bustling square. Tourists gathered, armed with cameras, eager to capture the majesty of the royal residence and perhaps catch a glimpse of one of its famously stoic royal guards. Among the throng of onlookers stood Karen, loud, confident, and utterly oblivious to anything beyond her own amusement. Karen wasn't your average tourist. She had a knack for turning every moment into a spectacle. Dressed in an eye-catching ensemble of neon pink sunglasses, a floral print jacket, and chunky sneakers, she was on a mission to entertain her growing social media followers with a show. Her phone was already live. Her followers tuned into her self-proclaimed comedic genius. "Alright, folks," Karen announced, speaking loudly into her phone. "Today's mission: make one of these royal guards smile. Let's see what they're made of." Karen scanned the square until her eyes landed on him. Tall, disciplined, and utterly still, the guard seemed carved from stone. His red tunic was spotless, his bearskin hat perched perfectly atop his head, and his gaze fixed straight ahead, unyielding. To most, he was a symbol of unwavering tradition and discipline. To Karen, he was a challenge. With her phone clutched tightly, she approached the guard, already narrating her thoughts. "Oh, he's good. Look at that posture. But don't worry, guys, I'm better." Karen positioned herself a foot away, careful not to touch him just yet. Her antics began with small gestures, a little wave in front of his face, a few exaggerated bows. The crowd chuckled softly, unsure whether to disapprove or be amused. "Come on," Karen teased, her voice filled with faux frustration. "Are you even real? Blink twice if you're human." The guard, of course, didn't react. Beneath the brim of his hat, his gaze remained steady, though he was fully aware of Karen's presence. What Karen didn't realize was that this wasn't just a ceremonial duty for him. He was part of a covert security detail, and his apparent stillness belied his intense focus on a more pressing matter. A suspicious figure had been lingering at the edge of the square, and the guard had been quietly monitoring his every move. But Karen was oblivious. She leaned in closer, holding her phone inches from his face. "Smile for the camera," she sang, striking a dramatic pose next to him. The crowd began to grow, drawn by her antics. Some were amused, others rolled their eyes, but Karen thrived on the attention. A few people even began recording her, their phones held high as they giggled at her audacity. To Karen, this was perfect content. "Okay, guys," she said to her live stream audience. "What should I try next? Maybe, oh, I've got it." Karen crouched down dramatically, pretending to study the guard's boots. "Such shiny shoes!" she exclaimed. "Do you polish these yourself? Or does a butler do it for you?" The crowd erupted into laughter, but the guard didn't budge. Karen's followers filled the chat with laughing emojis and egged her on to push further. Karen stood back up, putting her hands on her hips. "Alright, big guy. I guess I'm going to have to bring out the big guns." As Karen plotted her next move, the guard noticed the suspicious figure inching closer to the restricted gates. The man, dressed in plain clothes, had been hovering at the edge of the crowd, his eyes darting nervously. He clutched a small bag, his fingers fidgeting with the zipper. The guard's instincts told him something was off. He sent a subtle signal with his gloved hand, a nearly imperceptible gesture meant to alert nearby security personnel. But Karen was oblivious to the tension brewing in the square. She was busy setting up her next stunt. She stepped closer to the guard, invading his personal space. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you, the Unbreakable Man," she declared dramatically. "But don't worry, folks. I'll crack him." Karen pretended to mimic his rigid stance, standing as straight as she could manage while puffing out her chest. She leaned in, her face just inches from his. "Seriously, dude, what's the secret? Yoga? Pilates?" The crowd laughed, but the guard's focus remained on the suspicious figure, who had now moved closer to the gates. The man adjusted the strap on his bag, glancing nervously around him. The guard's sharp eyes caught every movement. Karen mistook the guard's heightened vigilance for a reaction to her antics. "Oh, I see it now. He's cracking. Look at that little twitch," she said, pointing toward his hands. She decided it was time for her piece de resistance. Dropping to the ground, she faked a dramatic faint, sprawling at the guard's feet. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people found it hilarious, while others were visibly uncomfortable. Karen stayed on the ground longer than necessary, waiting for the guard to look down or acknowledge her in some way. But the guard didn't move, not because he was unfeeling, but because his training dictated that he couldn't afford to break focus. The suspicious man had begun unzipping his bag, and the guard was mentally preparing for his next move. Karen's theatrics were little more than background noise. Finally, Karen sat up, brushing dust off her floral jacket. "Nothing? Really? You're good. I'll give you that," she said, a hint of frustration creeping into her voice. The crowd had begun murmuring, their attention now split between Karen and the man with the bag. A few people had noticed the man's odd behavior and started whispering to one another. Karen, however, was still absorbed in her performance. "All right, people," Karen said, addressing her live stream viewers. "I guess it's time for the ultimate move. This is gonna be legendary." She took a deep breath and reached out her hand, her fingers hovering dangerously close to the guard's uniform. But before she could touch him, the guard moved. It was a small shift, just a step forward, but it was enough to startle Karen and silence the crowd. Karen stumbled back, her confidence faltering. "Whoa! Okay, now we're getting somewhere," she said nervously, laughing to mask her unease. The guard's movement hadn't been for Karen's benefit. His sharp eyes were locked on the suspicious man, who had now reached the restricted gates and was about to pull something out of his bag. The square grew eerily quiet. Karen, for the first time, felt the weight of the guard's presence. Something serious was happening, and she was at the center of it, though not in the way she'd intended. "Wait, what's going on?" she muttered, her phone wobbling in her hand as the tension in the air became palpable. The guard took another step forward, his boots clicking sharply against the pavement. The crowd parted instinctively, and Karen's stomach churned with unease. This wasn't part of her plan, and she had no idea what was about to unfold. The crowd in the square seemed to hold its collective breath as the royal guard took another deliberate step forward, his polished boots striking the pavement with a sharp click. Karen's grin faltered as the man, once seemingly oblivious to her antics, now exuded an aura of palpable intensity. Something had shifted in the atmosphere, though Karen didn't yet grasp what. "What's this?" Karen muttered into her live stream. Her phone trembled slightly in her hand, though she quickly masked her unease with a forced laugh. "Oh, looks like Mr. Sirius finally decided to join the party." But this wasn't a game. Not for the guard, and certainly not for the man he was watching. Karen, still riding the high of her earlier theatrics, decided that this was her moment to regain control. If the guard was moving, it must have been because of her brilliance. After all, wasn't that her goal? To crack the uncrackable? "Well, everyone," she said into her phone, tilting it to capture her face and the guard's imposing figure behind her. "Looks like I finally got a reaction. Time to seal the deal." Ignoring the murmurs of the crowd, Karen turned toward the guard, her boldness returning. She positioned herself squarely in his path, blocking his view of the square. "What now, soldier boy?" she teased, puffing out her chest. "Are you finally going to say something? Or are you just mad because I'm winning?" The guard didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed over Karen's shoulder, locked on the suspicious man near the restricted gates. Karen, oblivious to his focus, leaned closer, waving a hand near his face as if to test his reaction. "Come on, big guy. It's okay to admit defeat," she quipped. The chat on her live stream exploded with comments, ranging from laughter to warnings. "Karen, stop! I think something's actually happening. Look behind you. Girl, you're about to regret this." Karen ignored the messages, too absorbed in her performance to notice the growing unease in her audience. She reached out, her fingers hovering dangerously close to the brass buttons on the guard's uniform. The guard's training kicked in. His focus wasn't on Karen, it was on the man with the bag. The man had moved closer to the gates, his hand now fully inside the bag. The guard's instincts told him something was wrong, terribly wrong. Through the subtle communication system embedded in his earpiece, he signaled to his team. Potential threat. Gate proximity. Black bag. Karen's antics couldn't distract him now. His posture shifted ever so slightly, just enough to create a clear path forward. Karen misread his movement entirely. Whoa! Look at this guy trying to intimidate me, she exclaimed, stepping closer. What's next? A march in my direction? The crowd's laughter turned nervous. A few people started edging away, sensing the tension that Karen was too self-absorbed to notice. A young woman in the crowd whispered, "Something's not right. He's not looking at her." At that moment, the man with the bag adjusted his stance. His eyes darted around the square, and his free hand reached for something clipped to his belt. The guard's eyes narrowed. His target wasn't just suspicious, he was preparing to act. Karen, still oblivious, began mimicking the guard's stance again, exaggerating her movements to draw more attention to herself. "Come on, buddy," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "You can't ignore me forever." But the guard wasn't ignoring her. He was preparing. The man near the gates finally made his move. In one swift motion, he pulled a device from his bag, a small, cylindrical object that glinted menacingly in the sunlight. It wasn't a weapon, but it didn't need to be. A smoke canister like this could create chaos in seconds, forcing evacuations and clearing the way for something worse. Without hesitation, the guard stepped forward sharply, his boots striking the ground with authority. Karen froze mid-gesture, her hands suspended in the air as she stared at him in disbelief. What's happening?" she stammered, her usual bravado faltering. Her phone wobbled as she tried to keep it steady, instinctively turning to follow the guard's movements. The crowd gasped as the guard closed the distance between himself and the man with the bag. His movements were precise, calculated. Karen stumbled back, her live stream forgotten as she tried to process what was happening. "Wait, is this part of the show?" she muttered. It wasn't. The man with the bag saw the guard approaching and panicked. He dropped the bag and fumbled with the canister, but the guard was faster. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it just enough to disarm him without causing serious harm. The canister clattered to the ground, rolling harmlessly away. The guard immobilized the man, his strength and training evident in every movement. Security personnel emerged from the crowd, quickly securing the suspect and retrieving the dropped bag. The entire square erupted into shocked murmurs. Karen stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape as the scene unfolded before her. The crowd, once laughing at her antics, now shifted its attention entirely to the guard. Applause rippled through the square as people realized the gravity of what had just happened. Karen's livestream chat was still active, and her viewers were less than kind. "You almost messed everything up. She really thought it was about her. OMG, that guard is a hero." Karen's face flushed red as she lowered her phone. For the first time, she felt the sting of embarrassment, her earlier confidence evaporating like mist in the sunlight. She took a step back, suddenly wishing the ground would swallow her whole. A security officer approached her, his expression stern. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clipped. "I need to have a word with you." Karen's heart sank. "What? Me? I didn't do anything." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You interfered with a highly sensitive operation. That guard wasn't just standing there for show, he was part of a covert security detail." Karen's mind raced, her earlier bravado now replaced with confusion and guilt. I didn't know," she stammered. "I was just having fun." The officer's expression didn't soften. "Your fun created a distraction that could have jeopardized the safety of everyone here. Do you understand the seriousness of your actions?" Karen glanced around the square, hoping for some support, but the crowd's mood had turned. People whispered and shook their heads, their earlier amusement replaced with disapproval. A man nearby muttered, She could have gotten someone hurt. Karen's live stream viewers continued their barrage of critical comments. She turned off the stream, her face burning with shame. For the first time, she realized just how wrong she had been. Karen stood frozen, her face flushed with embarrassment as the crowd's whispers echoed around her. The royal guard back at his post was the picture of unshakable composure. The man who had been apprehended moments earlier was now in the custody of the covert security team, his bag of suspicious items being closely inspected. But Karen's mind was still spinning, caught between confusion, guilt, and the remnants of her bravado. The murmurs of the crowd reached her ears. "Did you see how fast the guard moved? That guy with the bag looked dangerous. She could have distracted him at the worst possible moment." Karen's chest tightened as realization began to set in. Her antics, meant to entertain her followers and boost her online clout, might have endangered everyone in the square. She turned off her live stream, her hand trembling. The chat's comments, once filled with laughter, had turned into a scolding chorus. "She almost ruined everything!" And, "Not funny anymore, Karen." A security officer approached her, his sharp gaze cutting through her defenses. His voice was low but firm. "Ma'am, you need to understand what just happened here. This wasn't a game." The officer's words hung in the air as the detained man was led away, his face twisted in frustration. The bag he had carried was now being carefully examined by a bomb squad technician, who handled each item with utmost caution. Karen's eyes darted toward the bag, her curiosity overriding her shame. "What's in it?" she asked hesitantly, her voice barely audible. The officer glanced at her, his patience wearing thin. "Not something you should concern yourself with. Let's just say it's better in our hands than his." From her vantage point, Karen could see blueprints, wires, and what appeared to be a small device resembling a remote control. The technician muttered something into his radio, and Karen caught fragments of his words. "Disruption device, potential hazard, larger plan?" She felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just a random act, it was something bigger, something calculated. Her antics had been dangerously close to throwing everything into chaos. "I didn't mean to distract him," Karen blurted out, her voice cracking slightly. I thought he was just standing there, like a statue. I didn't know he was." The officer cut her off with a raised hand. "That's the point, ma'am. You didn't know. You assumed. And that assumption could have cost us dearly." Karen winced, his words hitting harder than any internet comment ever had. She crossed her arms defensively, trying to regain some of her lost confidence. "I wasn't the one with the bag. I didn't do anything dangerous." The officer's expression darkened. "No, you didn't. But your behavior could have distracted him at the critical moment. Do you understand what that means?" Karen nodded weakly, but inside she was grappling with the weight of his words. For the first time, her usual sense of entitlement was crumbling under the pressure of accountability. As Karen's eyes wandered back to the guard, she realized how little she truly knew about his role. To her, he had been an unmoving figure, a symbol rather than a person. But now, as he resumed his post, she noticed the intensity in his stance. His discipline wasn't just for show, it was a weapon, a shield against unseen threats. The officer seemed to read her thoughts. "That guard," he said, gesturing toward him, "isn't just there to look pretty for tourists. He's trained for moments like this, and today, he did exactly what he's meant to do." Karen swallowed hard, the enormity of her ignorance settling over her. "Does this kind of thing happen often?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "More than you'd think," the officer replied. "But most people never notice. And that's the point." While Karen grappled with her guilt, the security team worked swiftly to piece together the suspect's plan. The bag contained blueprints of the square, focusing on the restricted gates and the nearby palace grounds. The small device the technician had flagged was confirmed to be a signal jammer, capable of disrupting communications and creating chaos. In the corner of the square, a high-ranking officer joined the scene. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, assessing the situation before approaching the detained suspect. Who are you working with? He demanded, his voice low but commanding. The suspect sneered but remained silent. The officer's jaw tightened. You don't have to talk. We'll find out soon enough. The security team's quiet urgency contrasted sharply with the growing restlessness of the crowd, which had begun to disperse now that the immediate threat seemed contained. Karen, however, couldn't tear herself away. She felt like she owed it to herself, and to the guard, to understand the full scope of what she had almost disrupted. Gathering her courage, Karen approached the guard, who remained steadfast at his post. She stopped a few feet away, unsure of how to begin. Hey, I just wanted to say... She started awkwardly, her words faltering. The guard didn't move, his focus still unwavering. Karen sighed, feeling foolish. I didn't know, okay? I didn't mean to. I didn't think. She trailed off, realizing that no amount of excuses could undo what had already happened. The guard remained silent, his stoic presence a reminder of the gap between her antics and his purpose. Nearby, a middle-aged woman who had witnessed the entire scene approached Karen. Her expression was a mixture of sympathy and exasperation. You didn't mean any harm, she said gently. But that doesn't mean there wasn't any harm done. Karen nodded, her eyes downcast. I know. I didn't think it was serious. I thought he was just standing there. The woman smiled faintly. That's what they're supposed to make you think. But there's always more going on than meets the eye. Karen looked back at the guard, her admiration growing. He's kind of incredible, isn't he? The woman nodded. Yes, he is. And today, so are the rest of them. As the security team continued their investigation, Karen overheard snippets of conversations suggesting that the incident wasn't isolated. The suspect's devices hinted at a larger operation, possibly targeting the upcoming royal procession. The guard's quick thinking had not only stopped the immediate threat, but had likely prevented something far worse. Karen's chest tightened as the gravity of the situation fully hit her. She had come to the square looking for laughs, for content, for a moment to shine. Instead, she had stumbled into something far beyond her understanding, a world of discipline, sacrifice, and vigilance. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Karen slipped away from the square, her phone tucked away in her pocket. She didn't feel like streaming anymore. For once, she didn't need an audience. Her walk back to the hotel was quiet, her thoughts swirling with a mix of shame and newfound respect. The guard, the security team, even the murmuring crowd, they had all shown her a side of life she hadn't considered before. One where not everything was about her, where people worked tirelessly behind the scenes to protect and serve without seeking recognition. For the first time in a long time, Karen felt small. Not in a bad way, but in a way that reminded her there was a world much bigger than her own ego. Karen walked briskly down the cobblestone path, her oversized sneakers scuffing against the uneven ground. Her earlier confidence had crumbled entirely, replaced by a pit in her stomach that only deepened with each step. The lively square was now behind her, but the weight of her actions lingered like a dark cloud over her head. She replayed the scene in her mind, the stoic guard breaking formation, the quick takedown of the suspicious man, the crowd's gasps, and the murmured disapproval aimed squarely at her. Her followers on the live stream hadn't held back their opinions either. Karen almost ruined everything, and, wow, you really thought it was all about you, echoed in her thoughts like a harsh refrain. For once, Karen was at a loss for words. By the time Karen reached a nearby park bench, her legs felt heavy. She collapsed onto it, letting out a long, shaky sigh. Around her, families strolled peacefully, couples laughed, and children chased pigeons. To them, it was just another beautiful day in the city. But for Karen, it felt like her entire world had shifted. She opened her phone, hesitating before checking her live stream comments. When she finally did, her stomach dropped. What an embarrassment. Hope you learned your lesson, Karen. Can't believe you distracted the guard like that. That was dangerous. Scrolling further, she found one comment that stung the most. It's not always about you. Grow up. Karen closed the app and stared blankly at the screen. For years, she had built her online presence on making herself the center of attention. She thrived on the laughs, the shares, the validation. But today, those same eyes that had once admired her were looking at her with judgment, and rightly so. Unable to sit still, Karen decided to return to the square. She needed to see the guard again, not to mock him, but to understand. When she arrived, the square had mostly returned to its usual bustling energy. Tourists snapped photos, vendors sold trinkets, and the royal guard stood in his post once more, unshaken by the events of earlier. Karen approached cautiously, keeping a respectful distance this time. The guard's unwavering presence fascinated her. How could he remain so composed after everything that had just happened? How could he have handled both her antics and a legitimate threat without so much as a flicker of emotion? Karen found herself standing among a small group of onlookers. Unlike before, she didn't feel the urge to perform. Instead, she observed silently, her thoughts racing. Some people in the crowd recognized her, whispering to one another. A young man wearing a backpack leaned toward his companion and said, "Isn't that the girl who was making fun of the guard earlier?" His friend nodded. "Yeah, she almost got in the way of the whole operation." Karen heard them but didn't turn around. Instead, she clenched her fists and stared at the ground. She wanted to explain herself, to tell them she hadn't meant any harm. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't matter. Intentions didn't erase consequences. As Karen debated leaving, a security officer approached her. She recognized him as the same man who had scolded her earlier. His sharp eyes softened slightly when he saw her standing quietly, her usual bravado gone. "Back again?" he asked, crossing his arms. Karen nodded, unsure of what to say. I just wanted to see him again," she admitted, gesturing toward the guard. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Why? Planning another stunt?" "No," Karen said quickly, shaking her head. I wanted to apologize. Not that he'd listen, but I didn't know." The officer studied her for a moment, then sighed. "You didn't know because you didn't think to ask. That's the problem with people like you. You see a uniform and think it's a costume. You see tradition and think it's a joke. But you don't see the person underneath, or the responsibility they carry." Karen's face burned with shame. "I get it now," she said softly. "I really do." The officer nodded, his tone softening. "Do you, though? That guard isn't just a ceremonial figure. He's part of a covert security detail. Today, he stopped a man with a device meant to disrupt communications during an upcoming royal procession. That could have caused panic, chaos, and potentially something much worse." Karen's eyes widened. "A royal procession? You mean, the royal family was going to be here?" "Exactly," the officer said. "And that man with the bag? He wasn't acting alone. He was a piece of a much larger plan. Plans like this rely on distractions, on things going unnoticed. Your antics made his job easier, not harder." Karen swallowed hard. She had thought her actions were harmless, just a bit of fun. But now she realized they had been anything but. Karen took a deep breath and looked back at the guard. "Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" The officer smirked faintly. "Forgiveness isn't his job. His job is to protect this place and the people in it. Whether or not you learn from your mistake, that's on you." Karen nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She stepped closer to the guard, still maintaining a respectful distance. Bowing her head slightly, she said in a quiet voice, "I'm sorry. For everything." Of course, the guard didn't respond. But Karen felt a small sense of relief anyway. For the first time in a long time, her apology wasn't about seeking validation. It was about owning up to her actions. As Karen walked away from the square, she felt lighter but still reflective. She opened her phone again, this time not to check her comments but to draft a post. She wrote, "Today, I learned an important lesson. Not everything is about me. I disrespected someone who was doing their job, not realizing that job was far more important than I could have imagined. To the Royal Guard, and to everyone who keeps us safe behind the scenes, I'm sorry. I'll do better. She hesitated before hitting pose, unsure how her followers would react. But this time, it didn't matter. Karen wasn't looking for likes or applause. She was looking for growth. The sun dipped lower over the square, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. The crowd had thinned, the tourists leaving with stories of an unexpected spectacle. But for the covert security team and the royal guard, the day's work was far from over. In a secure room just off the square, members of the security detail gathered around a table cluttered with evidence. The suspicious man's bag lay open, its contents now catalogued and carefully analyzed. A technician handed a small device to the lead officer, who turned it over in his hands, his brow furrowing deeper with every glance. "It's not just a signal jammer," the technician explained, adjusting his gloves. "This thing is custom-built to disrupt multiple frequencies simultaneously: communications, GPS, even emergency alerts." The lead officer's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about causing a scene. They were planning to neutralize every layer of response. The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. The officer turned to his team. "Anything else from the suspect?" One of the agents shook his head. "He's not talking, but we've flagged his ID. He's connected to a group we've been monitoring, a network with suspected ties to coordinated attacks across the region." The officer set the device down carefully. "And the blueprints? They're focused on the palace grounds and key access points," another agent replied, spreading the papers across the table. "This wasn't a stand-alone operation. He was scouting for a larger team." Meanwhile, Karen wandered the nearby streets aimlessly, her earlier energy replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt. She couldn't shake the officer's words from her mind. Her antics, once a source of pride, now felt hollow and irresponsible. She paused at a small cafe and ordered tea, though she barely sipped it. Her mind replayed the moment the guard had moved into action, the precision, the calm intensity. She had mocked him, thinking he was just a performer, but he had been protecting the very space she had disrupted. Karen opened her phone, not to live stream, but to research. She typed "Royal Guard duties" into the search bar and began scrolling through articles. Her eyes widened as she read about their training, their responsibilities beyond standing at attention, and their dual roles in both ceremonial and operational security. "They're not just guards," she whispered to herself. "They're protectors." Her focus shifted to the day's events. She thought of the man with the bag, the strange device, and the way the guard had immediately sprung into action. Something bigger was happening, something far beyond her understanding. Back at his post, the royal guard stood as steady as ever, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced subtlety. On the surface he appeared unchanged, but his mind was sharp, processing every detail of the square. Through his concealed earpiece, he heard updates from the security team. "Suspect's devices analyzed. Likely part of a larger operation. Additional operatives unconfirmed, but we're increasing surveillance." The guard didn't move, but his jaw tightened slightly. He was trained for moments like this, trained to be the immovable line between danger and the people he swore to protect. And he knew the day wasn't over yet. As the sun set, the square's atmosphere changed. The remaining tourists lingered, snapping photos in the golden light, but there was an undercurrent of unease. Among the crowd, two figures stood out to the trained eyes of the guard. A man and a woman, both dressed casually but with an air of deliberate inconspicuousness, hovered near the gates. They exchanged brief glances but avoided prolonged eye contact with anyone else. The guard noted their body language, subtle hand movements, quick shifts in position. To the untrained observer, they were just another pair of visitors. To the guard, they were potential threats. Through his earpiece, he relayed his observations. "Two individuals, East Quadrant, near the gates. Possible coordination. Request secondary confirmation." Within moments, a plainclothes security agent in the crowd adjusted their position, subtly trailing the pair. The guard didn't break his stance, but his focus remained sharp. Unaware of the growing tension, Karen found herself wandering back toward the square. She didn't know why she was drawn there, maybe to apologize again, or perhaps to understand more about the world she had so carelessly disrupted. As she approached, she noticed something was different. The usual chatter of tourists was subdued, and several people seemed to be glancing nervously around. Karen's gaze shifted toward the gates, where the man and woman lingered. "Something's going on," she muttered. Her instinct to live stream bubbled up, but she quickly squashed it. Instead, she stayed back, observing quietly. Karen's eyes drifted back to the guard. He was as still as ever, but there was something about his posture, an almost imperceptible tension that she now recognized as readiness. Her earlier mockery seemed even more foolish in this light. This man wasn't standing still. He was waiting, prepared for anything. The man and woman near the gates began moving, their steps slow but purposeful. The woman adjusted her bag, while the man scanned the square discreetly. Their movements were synchronized, too synchronized to be accidental. The guard relayed the update through his earpiece. "Subjects moving west, towards secondary gate. Request containment." The plainclothes agent following them confirmed. "Acknowledged. Positioning team for interception." Karen, standing off to the side, noticed the shift in the square. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something was happening. The tension was palpable. Her eyes darted between the suspicious pair and the guard, who remained steadfast but alert. The man and woman reached the secondary gate, and the woman's hand dipped into her bag. At that moment, two plainclothes agents intercepted them, their movements swift and efficient. "Excuse me," one agent said, his tone polite but firm. "Can we speak with you for a moment?" The woman froze, her hands still in the bag. The man stiffened, his eyes darting toward the crowd as if calculating an escape route. "Don't," the agent warned, his voice low. From her vantage point, Karen watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding. The guard remained unmoving, his presence a silent reminder that he was ready to act if needed. The agents handled the situation with precision, their professionalism matching the guard's stoicism. As the man and woman were quietly escorted away, Karen felt a surge of emotions, admiration, guilt, and a newfound respect for the people who worked behind the scenes to protect others. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "I didn't see it before, but I see it now." The square, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, was almost serene again. The tense moments of the earlier arrests had passed, but the covert security team remained on high alert. They had apprehended 2 more operatives and neutralized the immediate threat, but the mystery was far from solved. Karen stood at the edge of the square, feeling a mix of awe and shame. She had come here that morning seeking laughs and attention but had stumbled into a world far beyond her understanding. Her antics had been selfish, but watching the guard and security team work with precision and discipline had ignited something unexpected within her, a desire to do better. Karen lingered by a vendor stall, pretending to browse postcards while stealing glances at the guard. She felt an inexplicable need to speak with someone, anyone, to make sense of the day's events. To her surprise, the officer who had scolded her earlier approached, his stern demeanor slightly softened. "You're still here?" he asked, crossing his arms. Karen nodded. "I couldn't just walk away. Not after everything I saw." The officer studied her for a moment before gesturing toward a nearby bench. "Sit." Karen obeyed, folding her hands in her lap like a schoolgirl about to face detention. The officer sat beside her, glancing around the square before speaking. "What do you want to know?" he asked. Karen hesitated, unsure where to begin. "Was it really that serious?" she asked finally. "The bag, the suspects, everything?" The officer nodded. "Serious enough. The first suspect was carrying a signal jammer and blueprints of the palace gates. The 2 we just arrested were likely scouts or decoys. We believe they were planning to disrupt the royal procession next week." Karen's stomach churned. "But why? What were they trying to do?" "Create chaos," the officer replied. "Cause a scene, distract us from something bigger. That's how these groups operate. One small disruption can spiral into something much worse." Karen felt a lump form in her throat. "And I almost made it easier for them. The officer's expression hardened. Yes. But you're here now, asking the right questions. That's a start. Karen glanced at the guard, still at his post. He never moved, even when I was being, well, awful. How does he do it? The officer followed her gaze. Years of training. The Royal Guard isn't just ceremonial. They're selected for their discipline and ability to handle high-pressure situations. They're trained to protect, to observe, and to act when necessary. Today, he did all three. Karen's admiration for the guard grew. She had underestimated him so profoundly, but now she saw him as a symbol of strength and duty. Karen sat silently for a moment, then took a deep breath. Is there anything I can do to help? She asked. The officer raised an eyebrow. Help? I know I messed up, Karen continued. But I want to do something to make it right. I don't want to just walk away and pretend this didn't happen. The officer's skepticism softened into something resembling approval. There's not much a civilian can do in an operation like this, he said. But if you're serious, there is one thing. Karen perked up. Anything. Share what you've learned, the officer said simply. You have a platform. Use it to show people why this matters. Explain what it takes to keep places like this safe, and why respecting that work is so important. Karen nodded, the weight of the responsibility settling on her shoulders. I will, she promised. The next morning, Karen sat at her hotel desk, her laptop open in front of her. She had written and rewritten her post a dozen times, but none of it felt right. Finally, she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let the words flow. Yesterday, I learned a hard but important lesson. I went to the square to make people laugh, but instead, I made a fool of myself and disrespected the people who protect us. The Royal Guard isn't just there for show, they're there to keep us safe, often from things we don't even realize are happening. They are disciplined, vigilant, and brave. And while I was busy making a spectacle of myself, they were stopping a real threat. I want to apologize to the guard I mocked and to everyone I distracted. I also want to say thank you to the security teams, the officers, and the guards who work tirelessly to protect places like this. You deserve our respect, not our ridicule. To my followers, let's do better. Let's be better. Karen hit post and leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. She didn't know how her audience would react, but for the first time, she didn't care. This wasn't about likes or shares. It was about doing the right thing. Over the next few days, Karen's posts gained traction, but the comments were different this time. People commended her for owning up to her mistakes and for shedding light on the hidden work of the Royal Guard. Others shared their own stories of learning to respect authority figures and the sacrifices they make. Karen felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced before. It wasn't about being the center of attention. It was about using her platform for something meaningful. Back at the square, the Royal Guard remained at his post, as steadfast as ever. He didn't know about Karen's post, nor did he seek recognition for his actions. For him, it was just another day, another duty fulfilled. But Karen knew. She visited the square one last time before leaving the city, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. She didn't approach the guard or draw attention to herself. Instead, she simply watched, her heart filled with gratitude and respect. Thank you, she whispered, though she knew he wouldn't hear her. Karen left the city a different person than when she had arrived. She had come seeking laughs and attention but found something far more valuable, a lesson in humility, respect, and the quiet courage of those who protect others. As she boarded her plane, she thought of the guard standing at his post, unyielding and vigilant. He had taught her, without ever saying a word, what it truly meant to serve and protect. And for the first time in her life, Karen wasn't the star of the story. And she was perfectly okay with that.